It's 5 years almost to the day since Mauricio Pochettino was sacked by Daniel Levy. For me, he's the greatest manager in my memory of supporting Spurs, but has he ruined his legacy by going on to manage Chelsea? And how good was he as our manager? Was he the best, as I think he was, or was he fortunate to inherit a group of players all coming into their prime at the same time? Discussing it with me as musician and long-time Spurs fan and season ticket holder Jo Dudderidge. How are you, mate?
Hey Barney, how's it going?
Yes,
Yeah, I'm all
very,
good, mate.
very good. You're in Marrakesh.
I am in Marrakesh. Yeah, a little bit of break. It's 27 degrees outside, and yeah, I'm pretty happy to be here.
Can I just say, even though you're a little bit dark, I feel like your background is quite Marrakesh.
Yeah, it's probably the most suitable background for where I am. But yeah, I'm just trying to find somewhere uh, to get away
The heat.
from the hustle and bustle and the heat. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. The miracle of technology. Well, before we go into Poch's legacy, guys, if you're watching or listening at home, please do press that like button. Please do subscribe to the channel for daily Tottenham content and more chats like this with brilliant, brilliant Tottenham fans. But I'm going to start with the hardest question of all, I think, Joe. Do you think Poch has ruined his legacy by going on to manage Chelsea?
I don't think so. I mean, considering his options at the time, I
Mhm.
think people were angry with him going to Chelsea, and I think it kind of made me think of. I mean, the dad analogy with Poch it always kind of rings true. Like it's almost as if your dad ended up sort of getting with someone that like a woman like that you hated or something, but you still love your dad but you're still angry at him for getting with this horrible person.
Yeah.
Um, and that's how I feel about the Chelsea thing. In some ways, I felt sorry for him because his options were limited. At the time, he had that time at PSG, which obviously didn't go particularly well on the European side, and he was left with a situation where he had him and his staff. You've got to remember he's got all of the stuff that go with him to every job, and he probably felt he had a responsibility to take that job when it came up. So yeah, but does it ruin his legacy for me? Not particularly. Does it make me think he could have made better choices? Definitely.
Yeah, that's a really good point about his staff. I've never really even thought about that himself. Obviously, he's got Jesus, Perez, and Tony as goalkeeping coach, and maybe that's a good point in terms of yeah, them having jobs and actually obviously they're not ever going to be paid as much as he is and trying to keep them in business. Because I also, yeah, if you remember, he also negotiates for them as well, doesn't he? He doesn't use an agent or anything. He negotiates for all of them. That's a really good point. I just want to go back to kind of the start with Poch and when Levy kind of got him in from Southampton. My recollection of it is that I think Levy at the time, if I'm right, was kind of going for Louis van Gaal, and then that didn't come through, and Poch was a bit of a second choice. Do you remember how you felt when Pochettino got the job and what your kind of expectations were, I guess?
It was very much a bolt from the blue, and I didn't really know much about him. I knew he was promising at Southampton and that they'd been doing well, and they had people like Alan Lallana, I believe, was in that side at the time, and
Yeah.
a young Mane. Um, and yeah, I remember he was someone with promise. There was this sort of feeling that we'd signed someone who maybe hadn't had particular success before, but that he was a young budding manager, and the jury was out for sure for quite a while. But I don't remember being like overjoyed when he joined. I remember just being more intrigued than anything. I think.
And do you feel a familiarity bringing it to the current day of that kind of jury being out, that kind of first year and a few months that Ange is in now? Do you think that's we're at a similar kind of tipping point?
Possibly. I think Ange comes from a different point of view. He's a much more experienced manager. He's been in many more leagues, whereas Pochettino came in as someone who you might recognise from, back in the day. I think he played in that side, which Michael Owen, he might have even been skinned by Michael Owen for that
He
famous
he
goal.
took yeah he no he took Owen down for the penalty in
That's
2002.
correct.
Actually,
Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah. So I kind of remember him, and even, even in his PSG days, just these sort of peripheral international figures that you sort of recognise. But so he felt like someone who was just past his playing days, possibly,
Hmm.
and was like a young manager that you might look at, someone like De Zerbi or someone even younger than that. So Yeah, whereas with Ange, he kind of comes with this sort of gravitas of, someone who's been in the game a very long time, albeit not playing or managing in leagues that we're particularly familiar with.
Yeah. And then as kind of Pochettino really started, in my recollection anyway, turning us from being kind of, like you said, the jury out to suddenly actually that feeling of, hold on, there's something happening here. What do you think were his attributes that he brought to the table that really enabled that growth?
Well, it certainly wasn't his English, was it, at first? Because we know all those first interviews, he was very careful to make sure his what he was saying was being uh, put across correctly in English, and it allowed him to have a barrier. But it was clear he was trying to get the team to play the game in a certain way. We had a young team. It was high pressing from the start, so there was this energy. But it took a while for it to click, for sure. Definitely didn't have the start that Ange did. We weren't top of the league or anything. I remember we were hovering mid-table for quite a while, so it definitely felt like that first season that things were, something was happening, and we'd have a good game, then we'd have a bad game, and it was very inconsistent for quite a while. So there are some similarities with Ange in that sense. Almost more this season than last season, where we kind of started amazingly and then tapered off over the course of the season as the injuries set in. Whereas this season, I feel like this is more like Pochettino's first season.
And do you remember, as I do, that kind of turning point being when suddenly he basically bombed out the old boys? He bombed out Adebayor and Yunus Kabul and
Kabul,
Roberto
yeah.
Soldado. And there were lots of reports kind of coming out, I remember anyway, of there basically being this kind of this group of younger players coming through like Mason and Kane and Townsend who were actually
Bentaleb,
starting,
yeah.
and Bentaleb, yeah. Although Bentaleb had got his chance really under Sherwood, hadn't he? I mean, I guess they'd all got their chance under Sherwood, but more that actually that young group of players not only were coming through, but also were starting to be a bit more vocal in the changing room, and that it seemed to coincide to me with then Pochettino, I think, or it felt like him thinking, okay, I'm actually just going to bomb out these old guys and go with the young guard. And that felt to me like the turning point.
Yeah, it definitely felt. I mean, I remember when Mason and Bentaleb were starting in midfield, and you're right to recognise Sherwood as much as I like his gilet more than most actually, but
I'm
he
glad you
was
brought up the
mocked.
gilet because I was going to.
Yeah, uh, but yeah, I think it was clear that he was putting his belief in young players, and I think he needed to do that because of the kind of system that he wanted to play. He needed people on side. He needed people to be running. We were running more than, it was
Yeah.
crazy the distances that, I mean, people think of Ericsson as a United player now, with everything that he's been through, but, he was running crazy numbers in every game. And that
Yeah.
was part of who we were. And I don't think we could really rely as soon as you have dissenting voices, and if you can't rely on them to do what the manager's going to do, you've got to get them out the door.
Yeah.
And that's what Poch did, I think. Some of those players maybe could have done a bit more, and maybe they were, I don't know if they were harshly treated or not, but I certainly think that Poch wasn't afraid to make those changes and get rid of some of the bigger characters in the changing room to allow those younger players, the emerging talents, to come through. Really, it was an exciting time.
Yeah.
And something that you could be proud of as a Spurs fan, coincided with the whole 1882 movement, that whole thing about trying to get an identity of young players back into Tottenham, which is, a big part of our heritage, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess a bit of a difficult question then. Obviously, he had these choices to make. He made those choices and that really helped. But looking back on Pochettino and that kind of peak Pochettino era, I guess from that time where there was the tipping point through to maybe the year before the Champions League final in terms of like this the absolutely brilliant form that we had. Do you think he was, majoritively responsible for that, or was there an element of him being in the right place at the right time? Where do you think he lands in that question?
Well, there's no doubt that some of these players would have always become good players through their own determination and talent, but he was that person who, brought a sense of responsibility to their careers at a time where it allowed them to become those top players. And it's hard to really say. You can never, would have told what would have happened to Harry Kane had he not had Poch. Would someone else would have been able to develop in that same way? So I guess it's a bit of a lazy answer, but it's probably a bit of both. You had right place, right time, a bit of luck, but he certainly seems to have a knack for working with and developing young players to help them bring the best of their potential. And I think we overachieved, and that's almost like the tragedy of that whole period. I know Hugo Lloris, and you may go on to mention this, has come out and said, if we'd had another season at White Hart Lane, who knows what would have happened. I can't comment on that as much because I didn't get my season ticket until the Wembley year. So because you couldn't get a ticket at Tottenham for those early Poch years, especially in the last year at the Lane. I think I saw 2 games. That's all I could get in for. Trying to get to that United game was impossible. So yeah, I think it's one of those things we probably overachieved in that period, and I think the board probably couldn't believe how it was going, and in some ways that hasn't helped our trajectory in some ways.
No, I completely agree. I mentioned it, I think, just in a video yesterday where I was saying like the reality of where Spurs were compared to where Levy and Enoch expected them to be were that they had the Northumberland development project planned since the beginning, since about 2005 or something like that. And the plan was build the stadium, move into the stadium, use the revenue to get into the Champions League, and then kind of catch up with Arsenal. And then Pochettino brought us about 10 years ahead of schedule, which, look, no complaints. It was amazing. But like you said, I think it did affect our longer term trajectory. And also I think probably, and maybe this was the biggest problem, gave Daniel Levy almost like a false sense of how big the club were and how ready they were to appoint managers such as Jose and Conte. I just want to go back to Poch and that question about, was he brilliant or was he in the right place at the right time? And just talk a little bit about him being kind of, do you remember us describing him as like the fullback whisperer? How basically every fullback who played under him became so much better. And I feel like Danny Rose and Kyle Walker are almost perfect examples because do you remember it the same way as I do? And that actually they were kind of a little bit like, they weren't loved by the Spurs fans before Pochettino came in. No. They were like seen as talent, but also who would make regular mistakes. And I feel like where Pochettino was really brilliant was with players like that, where he actually made them, he really changed the attitude of the fans to seeing them from people who were like, okay, players who were like, all right, to players who suddenly were like full-time England internationals.
Completely. I mean, Walker probably progressed, if I remember rightly, a bit quicker than Danny Rose did. But Kyle Walker, he went out on 2 loans. I remember he was at Villa, and when we got him from Sheffield United, he was incredibly raw. Some say he still doesn't have a final ball, but he really didn't have a final ball when he moved to Spurs. I remember he was incredibly frustrating to watch. And the other kid that we signed at that, was it Kyle Norton?
Yeah, maybe? So we signed them both together, and Norton was deemed to be the one with the real chance.
Yeah, exactly. And so, fair dues to Kyle Walker because, he's an unbelievable athlete, but he's also become a better footballer in time, better defender, better attacker, better final ball. But there was a period of time where I was like, is this Kyle Walker guy, is this going to work? So that wasn't dead set from the start. And you have to give all the coaches at Tottenham credit for that. And even, whoever was putting up on those loans to help develop him. And same with Danny Rose. He probably only had 4 seasons maybe where he was really great for Spurs.
He had a loan at Sunderland as well. I think if I remember rightly, he had a loan at Sunderland that really pushed him into the first team reckoning at Spurs.
And, his fitness was a big part of his decline, I suppose, and other issues off the pitch. But that period of time where he got those 2 fullbacks singing, it was quite wonderful to see. So everything kind of came together really beautifully in that period. And it was no wonder it was hard for the board and the manager to think about how they would add to that first team to make things better, because I remember everyone else was scratching their heads at the time, and it's easy with hindsight to be like, well, we didn't buy any players for 2 years, but actually no one could think of a player to replace that first team. So yeah, looking back now, Poch has managed to get a team of young players together to really compete and nearly win the league. Again, we're never top, but we were so close yet so it's far, and it's a shame really, because maybe all it would have taken was replacing Moussa Dembele in that January of 2019, or not selling him at all. I'd rather have had five more games out of him than 12 million from whoever it was.
Yeah. I think a
So
few of the players have come out since, haven't they, and said we just did not understand why we sold Musa
yeah,
Dembele.
it's bizarre. I
I
mean,
mean,
maybe Musa wanted the move. I don't know.
yeah, I think he wanted like a money move, but also he wasn't playing as many games. I mean, another difficult question, but obviously we reached, I think, one League Cup final, one Champions League final, two FA Cup finals under Pochettino. In hindsight, is there a reason for you why we never quite got that over the line? Any of those?
Harry Kane's fitness, Harry Kane's lack of big game play. I don't know. It's pretty harsh on Harry. He's one of the best goal scorers this country. If he's our
He's also our
country's best
highest.
goal.
He's also our highest ever scorer in North London derbies, which you could argue are the biggest games.
Yeah, it's not a cup final though. I mean, it's very very harsh, but it was very harsh of him to move to Bayern Munich as well. So
You're not
I'm
over it.
I'm quite I'm not over it. No, no, but we didn't show up in those finals.
No, we
But
didn't.
we have to respect the fact that we're not looking at Tottenham through the lens of an elite, the biggest clubs in the world. I think that's what sets the expectations of the fans to fail, and that is why I'm a realist and why I'm positive about the club, because I'm proud that we got to those finals. And it might sound like a loser mentality, but yeah, we lost to Chelsea, we lost to City, we lost to Liverpool. These clubs, minus, in the last 15 years, they're bigger clubs than Spurs, and we have
Hmm.
to swallow that pill. And if
Yeah.
we don't win in those finals, yeah, it's shit. It really is. But at the end of the day, we will get there.
Do you
And
remember? Do you
the
remember
more
the League Cup
consistently we do
final?
that,
Sorry, Joe. Do you remember the League Cup final against Chelsea where he played Sonny at left wing back?
Oh my God. Okay. It was such a strange tactical decision, and I'm not sure. I think I've erased it from my memory since you said it.
It was just one of those classic games where you looked at the team sheet and you're like, yeah, I'm not sure this is going to work. And then Chelsea just kind of Chelsea'd us. But I think in general, I think you're right. Like you said, like all the teams we beat, there was also the Man United in the cup semi-final, like when Dele Alli scored in the first few minutes. We should have won that game, but I do think there is something about clubs that have a history of winning things where there's a way, it's almost like a mentality of them getting over the line against clubs like us. And that's something in reality that Ange Postecoglou is talking about having to change at the club. And I think that's a really positive thing that he has noticed that and is referencing it personally.
Yeah, or it's like bringing 200 million pounds worth of players off the bench when we don't have them. So there's ways of looking at these things.
I think
Um,
that's true too. Yeah.
but yeah, Ange's right to, not question the, I know Conte questioned the club, but I think, what Poch changed in the mentality of that era of players was, raising their game, raising whatever levels were possible within them, physically and mentally, of course, which is often the biggest part of these elite players. And I think Ange wants to do that. And if people aren't with him, then I'd rather they left. I'd rather keep Ange for the duration of the project than keep players that aren't buying into this. So they really have to. These players have to look at themselves and wonder if they want to be on this ride, and if they don't, they should leave.
Is that you alluding to some of the reports this week that he's fallen out with a few of them? I think it's Romero, Bentancur, Udogi, and Vicario. That's what the reports say.
Well, yeah, just the spine of the team then. I'm not sure I believe those reports. I don't know how reputable that source was, but if these players can't take a few harsh words, then you've got to wonder what they're doing playing at this level. And I know that people say that players are different these days, but I'm sure Ange's got that. I'm sure he's got it under control, and I'm sure the players they should be as frustrated as he is with that last result. But bit of perspective from the fan base wouldn't hurt either. I know it's Ipswich and it's a shocker, but we've just got to move on to the next game. There's plenty to play for this season, so
Yeah,
I'm positive as always.
completely agree. So tough one as we come to the end of this. Back to Pochettino. Should we have stuck with him? And I mean, particularly at that moment where, as we mentioned earlier, the away form had been terrible for a year. They'd lost the Champions League final. From everything I've heard from some of the kind of journalists who get reports from inside the club, everyone came back that next pre-season kind of very down and feeling like they didn't have the kind of will to keep going under Pochettino. But in hindsight, should we have kind of given him the same chance that Diego Simeone has had at Atletico Madrid a few times, which is you've had a bad season, but you can rebuild? What do you think?
I think if Pochettino wanted that, then
Mm.
I think, yeah, we definitely should have done. But there were, you hear mixed reports about where his energy levels were at, if he was bored, if he was having his head turned. And I imagine that can't feel good within the club. I mean, those last few games, it was shocking, when Lloris broke his arm in the back of the net at Brighton, and it felt terrible. But I think if they had pushed on through, if Poch had a meeting with Levy and said, "Listen, I know things are tough, but I've got some renewed energy," then absolutely he should have stayed, because he could have been our Ferguson. But if he was out of ideas and out of energy, then I'm not sure you could really justify keeping a manager in place, because you've got a squad full of players there that needs motivating, and we all know how easy it is to fall down the league in the Premier League. And one thing Levy knows is that we couldn't afford to get relegated or anything like that. So these are the dilemmas that boards face when they're dealing with teams that have come to the end of their cycle. And, is Poch to blame for not renewing the squad? If he was saying to Levy he was happy with the team, then he has to take some responsibility for that as well. So I guess we won't know until the passage of time reveals if Poch comes out and says exactly what happened. But maybe he's
Yeah.
got one eye on coming back to the club at some point, and maybe that's
Well,
why he's not really spoken out.
Well, that is going to be my last question, but before I get on to that, like obviously Poch did talk about the painful rebuild needed at the time, so I think he was looking for maybe some more investment, and obviously the club were in a difficult moment at that point because they'd just put so much money or had so much money wrapped up in the stadium build. But also, as you alluded to, I think my recollection of it is that he was sniffing around trying to get the Man United job and trying to get something different. So I think it's a bit of six of one and half a dozen of the other. But yeah, like as I mentioned, I want to ask you, would you have him back at some point? Do you think that is something that could be in the future for Tottenham Hotspur?
Yeah, I would actually. And if he's still got the energy to do it, I think in some ways you can envisage a situation where Ange wins 3 trophies in the next 2 years, and then he gets snared for the City job, and Poch comes back with the painful rebuild done for him. Um,
I love that
but
positivity, Joe. Yeah, that's what's going to happen. Yeah.
but yeah, I don't think he's burned all of his bridges at all. There'll be a section of the fan base that won't forgive him for going to Chelsea, but I'm sure they'll soon forget about that as well. So anything can happen in football, as managers like to say, before they've moved to other clubs. So let's see how we get on with the USA job. And yeah, I don't know. I'd take it back. Everyone still loves their dad. Do you know what I mean?
That's exactly right. I would have my dad back as well. I think it's almost perfect. A couple of years taking USA to the World Cup. Ange Postecoglou does his best, maybe wins a trophy or two, and then yeah, Ange goes elsewhere and we bring Daddy back. Joe, thank you so much for coming on. Let the audience know where they can see your music, and I'll put it in the description box as well.
Yeah, if you just look up Later Youth or go to lateryouth.com, I've got a new single out, so check it out.
Top man, and enjoy the rest of your stay in Marrakesh. Guys, thank you so much for watching and listening. Please do press that like button. Do subscribe to the channel if you're not already subscribed for daily Tottenham Hotspur content. And as we get closer to the transfer window, Premier League transfer news and rumours as well. And also you can become a member. Just £1 a month really helps me make this content for you. All the details of how are in the description box below. But this is going to go out on Thursday, so we're 2 days before we go to the Etihad and turn over Manchester City for sure. Come on, you Spurs.